Please be seated. So every Sunday since early June, we have been skimming the surface of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and getting a few key stories in the life of David. Right now, we're also in the midst of the Gospel of John, where Jesus talks about nothing but bread in increasingly obnoxious ways for 5 solid weeks. So, as a preacher, I get to choose between bread or David. And since today is the last day that we read the book of Samuel, next week we turn very briefly to the book of Kings, I decided to do a kind of deep dive into David and his toxic and dysfunctional family. So, here we go. But be aware that this means that I will be mentioning things like sexual violence and incest and murder. Okay? 1st and 2nd Samuel is a history, sort of. It's the story of the rise and fall of David and his never terribly unified kingdom. And actually, the authors of Samuel are pretty ambivalent about whether having a king is a good idea or not. And mostly, they seem to think that it's not a great idea. And so the book of Samuel is a history, but it is a tragic history. And if we can understand it as a tragedy, I think a lot of it starts to make a lot more sense. Most of the characters in it have these huge tragic flaws, right? David is full of hubris. He's opportunistic. He's also a lousy administrator. He's prone to snap judgments, and he is a serial abuser of women. And let's be honest, he is a terrible father. One commentator said that you could almost learn how to be a good father by doing the exact opposite of everything David does. So, tragic flaws abound in Samuel, and tragic flaws always lead to plenty of irony. And biblical writers love irony. The reason that Absalom is caught absurdly hanging like a piñata in a tree today is because earlier on we are told that Absalom is so incredibly hunkalicious and his hair is so luxuriant that when he has it cut once a year, it weighs and is worth 200 shekels. So, of course, for his demise, he has to be ironically hoisted by his own ponytail. The irony and the tragic flaws that are baked into this story also mean that the cycles of violence and abuse that get set in motion early on get repeated and compounded with increasing ferocity later. And Absalom is a terrible, but really good example of this compounding cycle of violence. So here we go to the deep dive. A little background. Absalom's mother is a non-Jewish woman named Maacah bat Talmai. And she is the daughter of the ruler of this tiny principality of Geshur. So she was likely taken captive during war and claimed by David. Now, there is a section in the book of Deuteronomy which says that if a man takes a female captive in battle and marries her, thus having more than one wife, the man will love one wife and hate the other one, and the children of the unloved one will turn out to be rebellious. Well, guess what? Maacah is taken by force, brought into a plural marriage by David, gives birth to Absalom, who does what? Rebels against his father. But that's only one level of this tragedy, because Michal has two children by David, Absalom and his beautiful sister Tamar. And here's where we can see David's abuse of women getting repeated with increasing violence by his sons. Okay? David's eldest son, Amnon, is the child of Ahinoam, another woman who is, quote, plucked from obscurity and brought into plural marriage by David. And just as David sees, wants, and takes women, Amnon sees his half-sister Tamar, wants her, takes her, and not only rapes her, but then compounds the crime by refusing to take her into his household. He banishes her. Now, Tamar's tale of terror comes immediately after the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah. So it's the very beginning of the fallout of the rape and murder committed by David. In fact, the prophet Nathan tells David that because of what he did, God, quote, will make a calamity rise against you from within your own house. The rape of Tamar is where that starts, but it's not where it ends. David, when he learns of his son's crime against his daughter, he is upset, but he does nothing because, quote, he favored Amnon since he was firstborn. Terrible father. Now, when Absalom finds out what happened to Tamar, he bides his time for 2 years, then invites Amnon to a feast where Absalom orders his servants to murder him, which they do. Absalom then takes off to his mother's home in Geshur and remains there for 3 years or so until David begins, quote, pining for Absalom. Maybe because with Amnon gone, Absalom is now next in line for the throne, who knows? Absalom returns to Jerusalem, engages in a populist campaign of saying whatever people want to hear, and basically undermining his father at every turn. He does things like he stands outside the court and he hears people's complaints and says, you know, if I were in charge, I would fix that. And eventually, he gathers a mob of supporters and declares himself king. And David, who is old by now, takes a few male supporters and flees Jerusalem, leaving only the women to mind the palace. Absalom and his mob sweep in, and the very first thing he does as king, remember the increasing cycles of abuse of women? The first thing Absalom does is he pitches a tent on the roof of the palace and publicly and systematically sexually violates all of David's concubines. You can see how this all escalates. And today we heard how Absalom dies, and not long after that David dies, and Solomon takes over and tries to keep things together for a while, but really the whole monarchy thing just never works out. And the Book of Kings is basically Game of Thrones without dragons. In the end of all of it, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, and a huge part of the Jewish population is captured and forced to live in exile. The whole arc of this story is a tragedy. But it's more than a tragedy. I think it's actually an example of generational trauma. Remember, trauma affects everyone. It affects victims and perpetrators and witnesses. Everyone is affected, just in unequal and disproportionate ways. That's what Samuel we can see in there. Now, you might well ask, why is there such horrible stuff in the Bible? And I would answer, because there's horrible stuff in real life. Turn on any news feed and you will see similar compounding cycles of violence and trauma being tragically replayed all over the place. The Bible is not a sanitized description of the way things are supposed to be. It's more like a mirror that reflects who we are, at our best and at our worst. It's really a set of tools, stories and poems and letters and ancient law codes that are put together in a way to help us see how we really are. And reminding us, hopefully, that we always have a choice. Even in the midst of chaos, we can choose to be more or less loving, more or less merciful, more or less just. The Bible reminds us through all of these ancient stories that, in the words of contemporary singer-songwriter Kate Wallace, mercy brings mercy, and hate brings hate. Yes, in the book of Samuel, the cycles of abuse and violence and trauma escalate and spin out of control until they ultimately destroy David's family, and it eventually even dismantles the entire people of Israel. But we also have to remember that the Bible also tells us that a single, faithful, loving act, even one as small as a mustard seed, also has the capacity to grow exponentially and ultimately move mountains. Mercy brings mercy, and hate brings hate. And the choice is always ours. Amen.